Freeze. Don't blink. Don't breathe too loud. Feel that tremor in the air. That's not fear coming from you. That's the world realizing it just lost control. 911 got called because you stopped caring. Not because you screamed, not because you threatened, not because you fought, because you went quiet, because you detached, because one day you just looked at the chaos, the disrespect, the manipulation, the betrayal, and you felt nothing. And that's when they started shaking. You see, they were prepared for your anger. They had shields ready for your tears. They knew how to handle your passion, your loyalty, your forgiveness. But they had no protocol for your indifference. You used to be predictable. You used to react. You used to explain yourself. Now, you stare through people like they're ghosts in your peripheral vision, and that terrifies them. Because when you cared, you were controllable. When you cared, you were reachable. When you cared, you were human in a way that made you vulnerable. But when you stopped caring, you became something else. Something colder, something sharper, something that smiles like an angel but calculates like a psychopath. They don't know which version they're dealing with anymore. Are you the saint who forgives, or the demon who simply observes and waits? That duality is killing them. They want to label you, good or bad, nice or evil, victim or villain, but you don't fit into their little psychological boxes anymore. You evolved. Pain did that to you. Remember when you used to lose sleep over what they thought? When you'd replay conversations in your head? When you'd twist yourself into knots trying to be understood? That was the old you, the version that still believed love was enough. That effort was enough. That loyalty was enough. But pain taught you something darker. Pain taught you that attachment is leverage. Pain taught you that the one who cares the least controls the room. And when you finally understood that, you let go. Not loudly, not dramatically. You just stopped. Stopped explaining. Stopped chasing. Stopped defending. Stopped needing. And suddenly the energy shifted. They felt it immediately. The texts got longer. The calls got more desperate. The rumors got louder. Because when you stopped caring, you stopped feeding their power. And people panic when the supply runs dry. That's when 911 gets called. Not literally, psychologically, emotionally, energetically. Sirens in their chest. What happened to you? Why are you acting different? Are you okay? Oh, you're more than okay. You're free. And freedom looks dangerous to people who were benefiting from your chains. They mistook your kindness for weakness. They mistook your empathy for dependency. They mistook your heart for a leash. And now that leash is gone. Now you move differently. You speak less, but mean more. You smile, but it doesn't reveal your thoughts. You're calm in situations that used to break you. That calm, it's not peace, it's power. Because here's the paradox they can't comprehend. You're softer than ever, and more ruthless than ever. You don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't need applause. And that makes you untouchable. When someone insults you now, you don't flinch. When someone leaves, you don't chase. When someone tries to provoke you, you watch them burn themselves out. You became the storm that doesn't announce itself. The blade that doesn't threaten, it just cuts. They're shaking because they lost the emotional remote control. You used to jump when they pressed a button. Now, the batteries are dead. And the scariest part, you didn't stop caring because you turned evil. You stopped caring because you healed. But healing has a dark side nobody talks about. It makes you selective. It makes you ruthless with your time. It makes you allergic to disrespect. It makes you capable of walking away without closure. And people who rely on your emotional reactions, they feel like the ground just dropped beneath them. You see, chaos needs participation. Drama needs response. Manipulation needs emotion. And you opted out. That's the ultimate plot twist. You didn't explode. You evaporated. You became the version of yourself that operates in silence. The version that observes patterns instead of excusing them. The version that understands this brutal truth. If they feared losing you, they would have treated you like you were rare. Now they're realizing you are. And you're not as available as you used to be. You walk into rooms and say less. But your presence feels heavier. Not because you're angry, because you're detached. Detachment is misunderstood. They think it means you don't feel. Oh, you feel everything. You just don't react to everything. That's evolution. That's what pain does when it doesn't break you. It sharpens you. It carves away the naive layers. It strips off the desperation. It burns off the need to be chosen. Now, you choose. You decide. You evaluate. And that shift is terrifying, because you used to beg for connection. Now connection has to qualify for you. That's when the sirens start screaming in their subconscious. We're losing access. We can't read them anymore. They don't need us. Exactly, you don't. And needing nothing is a superpower. It turns you into a paradox. You can love deeply, but walk away instantly. You can forgive, but never forget the pattern. You can smile warmly, while mentally noting exits. You became unpredictable, and unpredictability, that's dominance. They can't manipulate what they can't anticipate. They can't control what doesn't crave approval. They can't threaten someone who already detached from the outcome. You stopped caring about being misunderstood. You stopped caring about proving your worth. You stopped caring about staying where you weren't valued. And suddenly, the people who dismissed you are trying to diagnose you. What happened to you? Pain happened. Growth happened. Awareness happened. You realized that over-explaining is a trauma response. You realized that chasing is a fear of abandonment. You realized that shrinking is self-betrayal. And once you saw that, you refused to participate in your own disrespect. That's when they started shaking, because you became the villain in their story. And here's the delicious irony. Villains don't ask for permission. Villains don't apologize for evolving. Villains don't cry when the crowd turns against them. They adjust. They adapt. They advance. You became the person they can't guilt trip. The person who doesn't respond to breadcrumbs. The person who won't lower standards for familiarity. And that scares them more than any outburst ever could. Because silence leaves room for imagination. And imagination is cruel. They don't know if you're planning. They don't know if you're replacing them. They don't know if you ever cared at all. You did. You cared too much. That's why this version of you had to be born. The one forged in disappointment. The one baptized in betrayal. The one who understands that not everyone deserves access to your depth. You're not cold. You're calibrated. You're not heartless. You're selective. You're not cruel. You're done overextending. And the moment you stopped caring about the opinions of people who never protected your peace, that's when the power flipped. 911 got called because they felt the shift. They felt the loss of influence. They felt the absence of your emotional labor. And now they're shaking. Not because you're loud, but because you're silent. Not because you're chasing, but because you're walking. Not because you're desperate, but because you're detached. And detachment is lethal in a world addicted to reaction. So let them panic. Let them speculate. Let them try to decode you. You're not here to be understood anymore. You're here to evolve. You're here to become the kind of presence that doesn't beg to stay. The kind of energy that doesn't need validation. The kind of force that can love like an angel and leave like a demon. That's the duality. That's the transformation. That's why they're shaking. Because the version of you they controlled is dead. And the one standing here now doesn't care who calls for help. You already saved yourself. Listen closely. That ringing you hear in the distance, that's not fear in your chest. That's withdrawal in theirs. They're detoxing from you, from your reassurance, from your overgiving, from your constant emotional CPR. You used to resuscitate every dying connection. You used to shock dead conversations back to life. You used to drag relationships on life support because you couldn't stand the idea of being the one who gave up. But now, you pulled the plug, calmly, without tears, without speeches, without a goodbye that gave them closure. And that silence is louder than any explosion you could have caused. Because when you stopped caring, you didn't just change behavior. You changed identity. You became the person who doesn't need to win the argument. You became the person who doesn't need the last word. You became the person who can walk away mid-sentence and sleep like a baby. Do you understand how psychologically violent that is to someone who fed off your reactions? They're used to tugging the string and watching you dance. Now they're pulling, and nothing moves. You're not cold, you're sovereign. There's a difference. Coldness is numbness. Sovereignty is control. And you're in control now. That's what terrifies them. Because control used to be external. It used to belong to their approval, their mood, their validation, their attention. Now it belongs to you. And people don't call 911 when someone is screaming. They call when something feels unstable, unpredictable, uncontainable. That's you. You used to be the hero in their narrative, the dependable one, the forgiving one, the always there one. Now you're the plot twist. Now you're the anomaly. Now you're the glitch in their psychological matrix. They thought they had you figured out. Oh, they'll come back. Oh, they'll apologize first. Oh, they care too much to leave. But something inside you snapped quietly, not in anger, in clarity. You realized that caring without boundaries is self-destruction. You realized that empathy without discernment is self-betrayal. You realized that loving people who enjoy misunderstanding you is voluntary suffering. And once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. That's the thing about evolution. It ruins your tolerance for chaos. You outgrew environments that once defined you. You outgrew conversations that once consumed you. You outgrew people who only felt powerful when you felt small. And growth is violent, not outwardly, internally. It kills old versions of you, the desperate one, the anxious one, the one who feared abandonment so much that you abandoned yourself first. That version died, and in its place, something dangerous was born. You, unattached, unapologetic, unbothered. You don't react the same. You don't chase the same. You don't beg the same. You don't even love the same. Because now your love has standards. Now your presence has prerequisites. Now your energy has a price, and not everyone can afford it. That's why they're shaking. They're not used to being evaluated by you. They're used to you auditioning for them. Now the roles reversed. Now they feel the tension. Now they feel the uncertainty. Now they feel what you used to feel. And they don't like it. It's uncomfortable not knowing where you stand with someone who used to overshare their entire heart. It's terrifying not having access to someone who once made themselves emotionally transparent. You became private, and privacy feels like power, because mystery forces respect. You don't explain your moves anymore. You execute them. You don't announce your exit. You take it. You don't threaten distance. You create it. And the paradox? You're actually softer now. But softer doesn't mean submissive. You feel deeply. You just refuse to bleed for people who wouldn't bandage you. You still care, but selectively, strategically, intentionally. You're not heartless. You're healed. And healing makes you dangerous to anyone who benefited from your wounds. Because wounded you was easier to manipulate. Wounded you tolerated crumbs. Wounded you confused chaos with passion. Wounded you thought inconsistency was excitement. Healed you sees through everything. The micro-expressions, the tone shifts, the subtle disrespect disguised as jokes, the half-efforts disguised as I'm trying. You see it all, and you don't confront it. You log it, you adjust, you detach, and that quiet withdrawal feels like an earthquake to people who never thought you'd leave. You're not angry, you're done, and done is colder than rage. Rage can be negotiated, done is final. When you stopped caring about being chosen, you started choosing yourself. When you stopped caring about being liked, you started being respected. When you stopped caring about losing people, you stopped losing yourself. That's the shift. That's the siren. They're shaking because the supply is gone. No more endless understanding. No more overextended empathy. No more bending your boundaries to keep peace. You became the storm that doesn't argue with the wind. You became the fire that doesn't beg for oxygen. You became the shadow that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. And unpredictability, it's intoxicating. They don't know if you'll stay. They don't know if you'll go. They don't know if you even care at all. And the truth? You care about yourself more than you care about maintaining illusions. That's growth. That's evolution through pain. You didn't become this way overnight. You were built here, layer by layer, disappointment by disappointment, betrayal by betrayal. Every time you forgave too quickly, every time you accepted less than you deserved, every time you silenced your intuition, you were learning. And now you trust that intuition more than anyone's promises. You don't need reassurance. You observe behavior. You don't need words. You measure consistency. You don't need to argue. You decide silently. That's the new you. Angel face, demon boundaries, saint-level compassion, psychopath-level detachment. And they can't reconcile it. They want you soft and reactive. You're soft and ruthless. They want you emotional and expressive. You're emotional and controlled. They want you predictable. You're strategic. And strategy looks scary to people who relied on your chaos. You stopped caring about losing people who were never scared of losing you. You stopped fighting for seats at tables where your name was never protected. You stopped explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. And now, you walk differently. You move differently. You think differently. You love differently. You're not here to prove anything anymore. You're here to experience life without self-betrayal. You're here to build without begging. You're here to connect without shrinking. You're here to exist without apologizing. And that level of self-containment, it radiates. People feel it before you even speak. They sense the shift. They sense that you're no longer available for emotional exploitation. They sense that you won't overextend just to maintain access. They sense that if they mess up now, you'll leave. No speeches, no scenes, no second chances disguised as understanding. And that possibility, that finality, that's why they're shaking. Because the old you would have stayed. The new you evaluates. And once you evaluate someone out, there's no appeal process, no emergency hotline, no 911, just silence and peace and growth. You stopped caring about being everyone's safe place. You became your own. You stopped rescuing others from the consequences of their behavior. You let them sit with it. You let them wonder. You let them feel the absence. And absence is a brutal teacher. It teaches people your value in ways presence never could. But here's the part they don't understand. You didn't stop caring because you hate them. You stopped caring because you love yourself. And self-love, when it's real, is terrifying. It has teeth. It has boundaries. It has exit plans. You can still laugh, still connect, still love deeply. But now, you can also leave without hesitation. That's the duality. That's the power. That's the evolution. You're no longer driven by fear of abandonment. You're driven by alignment. And if something feels off, you don't argue with it. You adjust. So let them shake. Let them call for help. Let them try to decode the silence. You're not malfunctioning. You upgraded. And the version of you that stopped caring about what drains you, that version is unstoppable. Because when you need nothing, you can build anything. When you fear nothing, you can become everything. And the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing left to prove. That's you now. Unbothered, unattached, uncontainable. Stand still. Feel how quiet it is around you now. No chaos pulling at your sleeves. No emotional static buzzing in your ears. No desperate need to fix what keeps breaking. That's silence. That's what power sounds like when it's not begging to be heard. They're still shaking. Not because you attacked. Not because you exposed them. Not because you destroyed anything. But because you withdrew your investment. And when an investor pulls out, companies collapse. You are the emotional capital. You are the stability. You are the oxygen in rooms full of smoke. And when you stopped caring, you stopped ventilating environments that were suffocating you. Do you understand the magnitude of that? You didn't explode. You didn't seek revenge. You didn't broadcast your transformation. You simply shifted your standards internally. And that internal shift rewrote the external dynamic. Now people look at you differently. They sense a wall. But it's not a wall. It's a filter. You're not closed. You're selective. You're not bitter. You're calibrated. Before, you'd hand your heart to anyone who smiled convincingly. Now, access is earned. Trust is slow, energy is protected, and protection feels hostile to people who are used to unlimited entry. They're panicking because they lost the emotional playground they used to roam freely in. You used to explain your silence. Now you let it speak. You used to clarify misunderstandings. Now you let people misunderstand and move accordingly. You used to chase clarity. Now you observe confusion and decide if it's worth your time. That shift, it's predatory in the best way. You became the one who hunts alignment instead of begging for acceptance. And here's the beautiful, terrifying paradox. You are kinder now, but you are less tolerant. You are deeper now, but you are less available. You are more loving, but you are less forgiving of patterns, because you finally understood something most people never grasp. You can have compassion without self-sacrifice. You can have empathy without self-erasure. You can have patience without self-abandonment. And once that realization hits, you can't go back. They want the old you, the version that over-explained, the version that gave infinite chances, the version that felt guilty for setting boundaries. But that version died in silence, buried under self-respect, coffined by clarity. You're not interested in being the bigger person anymore, if it means shrinking yourself. You're not interested in keeping peace if it costs your nervous system stability. You're not interested in proving loyalty to people who treat you like an option. And that's what makes you dangerous. You became emotionally disciplined. That's scarier than emotional volatility. Anyone can explode. Few can detach. Few can sit across from disrespect and feel nothing but confirmation. Few can watch someone reveal their true colors and respond with a quiet mental note instead of a meltdown. That's mastery. And mastery makes observers uncomfortable, because now they can't predict your breaking point. They can't manipulate your triggers. They can't weaponize your affection. You no longer bleed publicly. You process privately. You analyze silently. You adjust strategically. And when you leave, you don't slam doors. You lock them gently, forever. That's the part that keeps them up at night. You don't come back the same way. When you forgive now, it's conditional. When you reconnect, it's cautious. When you love, it's powerful, but not desperate. You're no longer afraid of endings. You understand that endings create space, and space invites evolution. You used to cling to potential. Now you evaluate reality. You used to romanticize effort. Now you measure consistency. You used to hope people would change. Now you accept them exactly as they are and move accordingly. That acceptance, it feels like cruelty to those who benefited from your optimism, because optimism kept you hooked. Now clarity keeps you free. They're shaking because they can feel your independence, and independence is intimidating, especially when it's quiet. You don't post about it. You don't announce it. You don't dramatize it. You simply embody it. You walk into rooms with less need, less urgency, less hunger for validation, and more hunger for peace. That's evolution. Pain stripped you. Disappointment refined you. Silence rebuilt you. You learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. It's the one who can walk away without trembling.
They called them in one by one old acquaintances, former rivals, people who once tried to dismantle you, people who once believed they understood the rules of your existence, as if you were something that could be mapped, measured, predicted. They sat across from each other with rehearsed confidence, certain they still had the upper hand, certain the story they told themselves years ago was still true. But the moment your name surfaced again, something subtle shifted. Not fear, not panic, just hesitation. The kind that appears when certainty starts to crack. The kind that shows up when memory doesn't line up with reality anymore. Because they remembered you as someone else, someone quieter than they expected, someone who didn't react the way pressure demands, someone who didn't fight when provoked, didn't scramble when cornered, didn't perform when watched. Back then, they mistook that for weakness. They mistook restraint for confusion. They mistook composure for passivity. They didn't realize they were misreading the entire situation. You were never playing defense. You were never trying to win. You were watching, listening, noticing patterns they didn't even know they were revealing. While they relied on volume, on posture, on exaggeration, you relied on awareness. And awareness doesn't age, it sharpens. So when they were asked to speak about you now, years later, their stories didn't land the way they expected. There were gaps, contradictions, moments where their confidence stalled mid-sentence, because the version of you they described no longer made sense, not compared to the one standing quietly in the background of the present. They expected confrontation. They expected resistance. They expected you to defend yourself, to clarify, to argue, to correct the record. That's how these things usually go. Noise answering noise. Ego meeting ego, but you didn't move. You didn't interrupt. You didn't explain. You didn't rush to reshape the narrative they were fumbling to maintain. You let them talk. You let them overextend. You let them repeat themselves, contradict themselves, embellish details that no longer held weight. And slowly, without you doing anything at all, people began to notice, not what was being said, but how it was being said. The tightening jaw, the sudden defensiveness, the way small questions triggered oversized reactions, the way calm inquiry was met with emotional urgency, the way facts blurred the louder the speaker became. Observers started comparing tone to truth, posture to credibility, reaction to reality, and that's when the shift really began. Because while others were still trying to control the story, you were simply existing inside it, steady, consistent, unchanged. Your presence didn't demand agreement. It didn't push for validation. It didn't need to convince anyone of anything. It just stayed coherent. And coherence is unsettling to people who survive on distortion. They kept expecting you to crack, to flinch, to match their intensity. They assumed silence meant pressure was working. That restraint meant you were cornered. That composure meant you were calculating an escape. They didn't understand that silence was never your shield. It was your mirror. The more they spoke, the clearer it became who was still reacting to the past and who had already moved beyond it. You weren't frozen. You weren't avoiding. You weren't stuck. You were settled and settled. People don't rush to be understood. They trust that understanding arrives on its own timeline. That's what confused them most, because the old strategies stopped working. Provocation didn't provoke. Accusations didn't escalate. Exaggeration didn't trigger correction. The more they tried to pull you into the old dynamic, the more obvious it became that you were no longer there. You had outgrown the framework they were still operating inside. So the pressure shifted direction. Instead of pushing against you, it started collapsing inward. People began asking quieter questions, not out loud at first, internally. Why does this feel off? Why does the reaction seem bigger than the issue? Why does the calm one feel more credible than the loud one? They started watching patterns instead of statements, consistency instead of claims, behavior instead of branding, and every time they did, you came out intact. You didn't need to correct the narrative because it was correcting itself. Each exaggeration made the truth sharper by contrast. Each overreaction carved more space around your steadiness. Each attempt to define you revealed more about the person doing the defining. They didn't realize they were auditing themselves. You weren't immune to pressure because you were powerful. You were immune because you were aligned. Your words matched your actions. Your pace matched your values. Your silence matched your awareness. Nothing about you was fragmented, and fragmentation always shows under scrutiny. They kept circling back to old stories, hoping repetition would restore authority. But repetition without substance only amplifies emptiness. The more they tried to resurrect past versions of you, the more it became clear those versions no longer existed. You hadn't evolved loudly. You hadn't announced anything. You hadn't rebranded or reinvented yourself for approval. You had simply continued, and continuation, done quietly, is one of the most destabilizing things to people who rely on interruption and chaos. Observers began defending you without realizing they were doing it. Not passionately, not aggressively, just with small, grounded observations. That doesn't match what I've seen. That feels exaggerated. Their reactions seem disproportionate. Simple statements, calm questions, and each one landed heavier than any argument ever could. Because they weren't defending you. They were defending coherence. You never asked for support. You never rallied anyone to your side. You never framed yourself as misunderstood or wronged. You didn't need to. Integrity attracts protection without requesting it. The people who once tried to dismantle you started recalibrating their tone. Some softened, some went quiet, some doubled down and lost credibility in real time. Others avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly aware that the room had changed orientation, not around them. Around you, and you still hadn't moved. That's the part they couldn't accept. That nothing dramatic was required, that no confrontation was necessary, that no explanation was demanded, that no defense was staged. Awareness had done the work. Your calm wasn't strategic, it was natural. The result of having nothing to hide, nothing to prove, nothing to protect. You weren't guarding an image. You were grounded in yourself, and grounded people don't need to win narratives. They let narratives exhaust themselves. So as the conversation stretched on, as the pressure kept trying to find a place to land, it became obvious there was nowhere for it to go. You weren't absorbing it, you weren't reflecting it, you weren't amplifying it. You were neutral. And neutrality, when paired with clarity, becomes an invisible boundary. No manipulation can cross. They began to sense it, that they couldn't reach you the way they once thought they could, that the old levers no longer worked, that whatever version of you they had constructed in their minds had quietly dissolved. You weren't resisting them, you were simply no longer available for distortion, and that realization hadn't fully settled yet. It was still forming, still uncomfortable, still unfinished. The room hadn't reached its conclusion, but something irreversible had begun. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through pauses, through the moments where conversation stalled and no one rushed to fill the silence, through the way eyes lingered on you a second longer than necessary, as if people were recalculating something they had taken for granted. Because once doubt enters a constructed story, it doesn't leave quietly. They started noticing how often the narrative about you relied on emotion instead of evidence. How frequently it leaned on interpretation instead of observation. How many details changed depending on who was telling it and who was listening. At first, they brushed that off. Everyone tells stories differently. Everyone remembers selectively. But then they compared notes, and the inconsistencies stacked up. Meanwhile, you remained exactly the same. Same tone, same pace, same restraint, same refusal to perform. You didn't sharpen your words to sound convincing. You didn't soften your posture to look harmless. You didn't adjust yourself for the room. You let the room adjust to you. That's when the dynamic quietly inverted. The pressure that was meant to weigh on you began pressing outward. Instead, people who once felt comfortable accusing started feeling exposed. Not because you challenged them, but because clarity has a way of illuminating excess. The louder they became, the more disproportionate it looked beside your composure. The more urgency they displayed, the more unnecessary it felt. They were trying to control perception. You were letting perception breathe. And breathing space changes everything. Observers began trusting their own senses again. Not what they were told to think, but what they could actually see. They noticed how you listened fully before responding, how you didn't twist words or dramatize moments, how your version of events never needed embellishment. It was consistent, and consistency, over time, becomes undeniable. You didn't present yourself as flawless. You didn't claim innocence or perfection. You didn't position yourself as a victim or a hero. You simply remained accurate. You acknowledged complexity without feeding chaos. You held nuance without collapsing into defensiveness. That alone set you apart, because people who manipulate narratives depend on extremes, on absolutes, on urgency, on forcing others to pick sides before thinking. You gave no such pressure. You allowed people to arrive at their own conclusions. And when people feel free to think, truth tends to surface. The ones who had built their identity around opposing you felt it first. They became their certainty frayed. They began repeating themselves more often, as if volume could replace substance. They interrupted more, deflected more, explained more than anyone asked them to. That's when observers started leaning back instead of in. Because over-explanation is rarely a sign of confidence. You watched it all unfold without satisfaction, without resentment, without commentary. Not because you didn't notice the shift, but because you didn't need to react to it. Reaction would have tethered you to the very dynamic that was dissolving. You stayed unattached, and detachment, when rooted in self-trust, is profoundly disarming. Some people tried a different approach. Softer tones, strategic humility, reframed accusations disguised as concern. But even those attempts collapsed under the same weight, because authenticity isn't just about words. It's about timing, coherence, and restraint. You weren't adjusting your story to fit the moment. You were living inside one continuous line of truth, and people felt that. They began defending you without defending you. Not with loyalty, not with allegiance, but with observation. Simple remarks, calm clarifications. That doesn't align with what I've seen. That feels exaggerated. The response seems bigger than the behavior. No one needed to rally. No one needed to argue. The environment itself was recalibrating, because when clarity enters a space, chaos becomes obvious without being attacked. Those who once believed they controlled the room felt it slipping, not dramatically, subtly, like losing grip on something they didn't realize they were holding too tightly. Their influence waned not because you replaced it, but because it no longer made sense. You weren't offering an alternative narrative, you were offering reality. And reality doesn't compete, it persists. As time passed, the urgency faded. The accusations lost momentum, the emotional spikes flattened out. People stopped bringing your name up as a focal point and started referencing it as context, not as a threat, not as a problem, as a constant. That's when respect began to emerge. Not admiration, not praise, but recognition. Recognition that you couldn't be moved by pressure. Recognition that you couldn't be baited into distortion. Recognition that you didn't need to control perception to remain intact. You hadn't won anything. You had simply stayed whole, and wholeness is incredibly difficult to undermine. Those who once underestimated you realized the cost of that misjudgment. Not because you punished them, not because you corrected them publicly, but because they were now forced to carry the awareness of having been wrong. And awareness is heavier than blame. You left the situation unchanged externally, yet nothing felt the same afterward. Conversations had a different tone. Assumptions were made more carefully. Accusations were tempered. People listened longer before speaking. The room learned something. That restraint is what sealed it. Because anyone can argue, anyone can defend, anyone can react, Very few can remain coherent while being misrepresented. Very few can allow truth to surface without rushing it. You did, and the narrative collapsed, not with noise, not with confrontation, not with exposure, but with exhaustion. It ran out of energy because it had nothing real left to feed on. All that remained was clarity, and you were still standing inside it, unchanged, grounded, unbothered, as the story finally reached the point where it could no longer continue the way it began. By the time the dust settled, no announcement was made. There was no moment of public reckoning, no dramatic reversal, no loud acknowledgement of what had really happened. And that was the point. Truth rarely needs a stage, it only needs time. People began treating the past version of the story like something outdated, something that no longer fit the facts in front of them, not because anyone instructed them to, but because holding on to it started to feel uncomfortable. It required too much justification, too many mental adjustments, too much ignoring of what was now obvious. You didn't step forward to claim vindication. You didn't revisit old moments to prove anything. You didn't remind anyone of what they once believed. You let the silence do what it does best, separate what's real from what was exaggerated. And in that silence, something settled. Those who once felt confidence speaking over you grew quieter, not out of shame, but out of recalibration. They realized that certainty built on assumption is fragile, that confidence fueled by reaction doesn't last. That composure, when sustained, carries its own authority. You became a reference point without becoming a topic. People measured behavior against you without saying your name. They paused before exaggerating. They hesitated before aligning with emotion over evidence. Not because they feared consequence, but because they had learned something through observation. They had seen what happens when consistency meets time. What surprised them most wasn't that the narrative fell apart. It was how little effort it took on your part. You didn't dismantle it. You didn't counter it. You didn't engage with it long enough to give it shape. You simply refused to become distorted by it. And distortion needs participation to survive. Your calm didn't just protect you, it exposed the imbalance around you. It made overreaction visible. It made manipulation obvious. It made performance stand out as performance. Without you saying a word, some people will never admit they misjudged you. They'll rewrite the story quietly in their own minds, convincing themselves they always saw things clearly. And that's fine. Recognition doesn't need confession to be real. Others will remember the shift more honestly, the moment they realized something didn't add up, the moment they noticed your steadiness while everything else fluctuated, the moment they trusted their own observation instead of someone else's interpretation. That's where real correction happens, not through confrontation, not through exposure, through awareness. You didn't become louder to be heard, you became clearer, and clarity has a way of carrying further than noise ever could. Now, when your presence enters a space, it doesn't stir reaction, it brings a kind of quiet recalibration. Conversations become more precise. Assumptions soften, people listen a little longer, not because you demand it, but because your presence sets a tone that doesn't invite chaos. You didn't gain influence, you revealed it. And you did it by staying aligned with yourself when misalignment was encouraged, by staying accurate when exaggeration was rewarded, by staying grounded when reaction would have been easier. That's not strategy, that's integrity. The story that once surrounded you no longer has a center. It can't attach, it can't grow, it can't provoke, because there's nothing in you for it to grip. You're not carrying resentment forward. You're not carrying the past with you. You're not waiting for validation. You're moving on with a steadiness that doesn't need acknowledgement. And that's the part most people don't talk about. The aftermath, the quiet shift where nothing dramatic happens, but everything feels different, where trust reforms slowly, where perception matures, where people learn without being taught how to separate truth from performance. You didn't just outlast the noise, you outgrew it. And now whatever comes next meets a version of you that has already proven something important, not to others, but to yourself. That you don't need to fight narratives to survive them, that you don't need to explain truth for it to stand. That calm, when sustained, becomes undeniable. This isn't a victory, it's a return to balance. You remain composed. You remain consistent. You remain intact. And the world, quietly and without ceremony, adjusts around that.